Hello, everybody. I'm going to be taking you through a discussion on the framework for researching African food systems. My name is Julian May. I'm the Director of the Centre of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape and a partner on the FSNet program. So we're going to be going through how we build a framework to understand African food systems and how that framework can then be used to develop our own research projects. Okay, so I'd like to start by talking you through the idea of concepts and what is a conceptual framework anyway. So we're going to use a conceptual framework to guide research, but to be able to do so, we first need to think through what we mean by concepts and a conceptual framework. The first is that concepts are not neutral. They are defined by their components, and we need to think through what those components are quite carefully. So in the framework, I'm going to take you through what are the components of a food system. The second thing that is important is to recognize that every concept has a history. Concepts don't simply manifest. They are developed by people, and they're developed by people who, from their particular backgrounds and their particular ways of thinking. So different disciplines will think about concepts in different ways. Different disciplines may well think about the same concept in different ways, and always concepts will be debated. Concepts also evolve out of historical backgrounds. So many of the concepts that we deal with in development, in our work on development, are concepts that have evolved out of Europe and America. Those are not always relevant, and the whole idea is that we need to continually think about how do we challenge a concept? How do we think, what does this concept really mean, and does it actually apply to our circumstances? Next, concepts relate back to other concepts. So an idea about what Africa is or what Africa isn't, what Africa is capable of, relates back to history, relates back to how Africa has been conceptualized in the past, at a time when Africa was often thought about as a place where they would provide labor and it would provide resources. Concepts must be understood relative to their own components, as well as to other concepts, and critically to the problem that the concept is supposed to address. So in this framework, when we talk about the different components of the food system, we need to think about how does that component relate to a particular problem or a particular issue, and how is it going to solve or help us address that issue. Finally, as we do in this framework, a conceptual framework brings together concepts into a written or visual representation, and in particular, show the expected relationships between them. So in the document, you will notice that we have a couple of frameworks and a couple of representations of the framework. These are ways in which we try and bring the ideas together. We can see how the food system is animated by relationships. I expect some of you are familiar with quantitative research methods. And there, when we think about a conceptual framework, most typically we try to think about how to identify causes and effects. And then we would find a set of variables that can serve as indicators of those causes and effects. And we might think about building research designs that allow us to see whether or not a particular effect can be brought about by changing the causes. Qualitative research is often more complex because there we need to think about how to link a network of concepts together and then theorize what might be the relationship between these. We're looking for the narratives rather than causal relationships, and we're looking about how things might change and why that is the case rather than the extent to which that change takes place. But we also have to recognize that the key theme of this FSNet program, food itself is a concept. So I'm showing you two definitions here. The one is from the Codex Alimentarius, which lists definitions of all food. It's prepared by the FAO. It involves experts from around the world. Some of those experts are themselves members of the FSNet program, and I'm sure you will meet them later as you go through this course. And they have a quite clear definition which explains what food is. Any substance, whether processed, semi-processed, or raw, which is intended for human consumption, and any substance which has been used in the manufacture, preparation, or treatment of food. So in other words, the additives, the various things that are put into food to allow powders to run freely, all of those, according to this definition, are categorized as food. The next is that food could be thought about as a highly condensed social fact. This definition is proposed by an Indian anthropologist, Aryan Appadurai, who tried to investigate how people think about food as something that is relevant to their culture, to their history, that tells us about labor practices, that tells us about how people interact with their environment, tells us something about our history, why we favor particular kinds of food, why others are unpleasant. So if I tell you that I am from Durban, and I spent most of my life living in Durban, the South Africans in this program would know that I most certainly would like a bunny chow. For those of you who are not from South Africa, a bunny chow is not something that is made out of rabbit. It's a food consisting of curried beans, put into a half loaf of bread. And why it's of historical interest, it's a food that Indian people who were brought to South Africa to cut cane used to take out into the fields to eat because it provided so much energy and because it was convenient to carry. So bunny chows are a very good example of food which is a highly condensed social fact. It tells you about where you're from. It tells you something about the history of that area. It tells you something about how things have changed in that part of the world. Now, as with concepts, we can also think about different ways of defining the ideas that we're wanting to use. And here are the different definitions of food systems that are provided in your framework document. The first is the most simple, where a food system is thought of as a process that turns natural and human-made resources and inputs into food. This very simple definition comes from Per Pinstrup Anderson. In fact, Per Anderson won the World Food Prize in 2001 and is one of the foremost thinkers about how food security is achieved and how food systems operate. Although simple and easy to communicate to policymakers, we need to go a little bit beyond this to try and think about, well, what then are the components of a food system? And this is where the Food and Agriculture Organization assists us. It's the FAO at the bottom there. Here, food systems are recognized as including the range of actors, the intellect activities that are involved in the different components of producing food. That includes the production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and ultimately the disposal of food waste. And that recognizes that food is derived from agriculture, from forestry, from fisheries, and are linked to the economic, societal, and natural environments. So a much more comprehensive definition that allows us to get to grips with some of the concepts that lie within a food system. But the definition that we prefer in FSNet is derived from the high-level panel of experts, the HLPE, who are the advisory committee who also inform the FAO as well as the World Council on Food. Here they define the food system as the elements, and that's the environment, the people, the inputs, the processes, and the activities that relate to the different activities and that are required to produce and to consume food, and the different outputs and outcomes that follow from the food system. Okay, so once again, we have something which focuses on components, and here recognizes that food systems are expected to produce different outcomes. Preparing the framework for you, we've examined 11 different food system conceptual frameworks. We've chosen to present only 2 of these, the HLPE framework and the one which we believe is the most appropriate framework for the work that you will be doing as part of your FSNet work. In reviewing those different conceptual frameworks, we asked a number of questions. Firstly, is it a multidimensional framework? Does it consider multidimensional outcomes? Does the framework define and discuss the drivers of food system change? Is it clear about what are the internal components of the food system? And does it distinguish the actors and the activities? What is the usefulness of defining the components in the way that the framework has done? Does the framework depict in detail interactions between the components? And does it allow us to see what are how do food systems operate? Does it allow us to give some sense of what the trade-offs are in the food system and how these might take place and what are the consequences of those trade-offs? And finally, and most importantly for our work at FSNet, is the framework geared for the practical application so that we can think about policy impacts and the potential trade-offs when we're designing different kinds of policies. Ultimately, all of the 11 frameworks that we examined came down to three elements, and that you'll see at the bottom of the slide. The drivers of the food system that bring about change, the internal food system components within which production, processing, consumption take place, and a set of outcomes. In addition, all of the frameworks that we examined focused our attention on the different ways in which they were connected, with drivers being related to outcomes, so socio-economic change, for example, how that influences changes in diet, as well as outcomes and how they might influence drivers. So if we are increasing the amount of food that is available, what bearing does it have on the environment? So commonly always then drivers, components, and outcomes are the key issues involved in a food security framework. So the first framework which I'd like to talk through with you is that is produced by the high-level panel of experts. This is very widely cited, and it's also been a framework that has been adapted to suit more specific food systems environments, and it allows us to focus on the environment, the behavior of consumers, and the diets that they consume. It's a detailed framework and we find it particularly useful to identify key points for interventions. It pays attention to the fact that the food system is complex and it is dynamic. So it takes into account the interactions between the different components of the food system, the outcomes, and the drivers. At the top, you'll see the list of drivers that the HRP propose: the biophysical and environmental drivers, innovation and technology, political and economic, social culture, and the demographic drivers. Sociocultural include issues of culture, religion, traditions, as well as issues of gender. The demographic drivers also include issues of how the population is changing, how it is growing, issues of urbanization, as well as human health. Biophysical, for example, then focuses on the ecosystem and issues of climate change. At the level in the middle, you've got the components of the food system. For the HRP, they focus on food supply chains and food environments. On food supply chains, you've got the production, storage and distribution, processing and packaging, and then ultimately retail environment. The food environment then, the availability of food, economic access, how it is advertised, and issues of food quality and safety. These then are related to how consumer behavior, how consumers choose particular items, the kinds of diets that consumers use, and ultimately then the impacts on the environment of those diets. Finally, at the bottom, you have the links to the political and program and institutional actions that try and modify the food environment, whether it's changing supply chain, how supply chains operate, or trying to persuade consumers to eat different foods. The HRPE linked this to the Sustainable Development Goals, the goals that we're trying to target towards 2030 as a part of a global pact on how to bring about sustainable development. At the bottom of the HRPE, they finally relate back to the components of food security. That is the availability of food, how accessible it is, and its utilization. Since preparing this framework, the HRP have gone further, and they have more recently proposed that in addition to availability, access, and utilization, other important dimensions of food security are the agency of humans to be able to make decisions about their food system, and the stability of the system and its different components. Which brings me finally then to the graphical depiction that we are proposing for FSNet to try and understand how a food system operates. So we've largely drawn on the HRPE framework and continue to identify a set of drivers, a set of food system components, and a set of food system outcomes. At the top, we've taken largely the same drivers as the HRPE. Once again, biophysical, infrastructural, and so on. Importantly, we've added one other component, which is recognizing that food systems operate in a place, and how that place functions and how decisions are taken about that place are important drivers. So there we have included the notion of a territorial driver. Territory is a concept largely drawn from French sociological thinking, which recognizes that a place isn't simply a geographic space, but also something which is related to the people who live there and the way in which they interact with one another. The food system components are in the center of the diagram. Again, very similar to the HRPE, but a few things that I'd like to draw your attention to. On the right of the diagram, we have a box which is labeled capitals. Here we've chosen to use the idea of the sustainable livelihoods approach, which identifies 5 important capitals that humans have access to in order to generate a livelihood. These are the financial capitals, essentially money and wealth, social capital, the networks that people have, the kinds of values of a society, human capital, people's skills and education, physical capital, the infrastructure that is available, the roads, the networks, the ports and harbors and so forth. And finally, natural capital, the physical environment, its biodiversity, and the land that is available, the water that is available. So that is a sustainable livelihoods approach, is a very useful way to think about organizing how we think humans can coordinate the capitals that are available to them in order to be able to generate a livelihood. On the left of the diagram, we've chosen to include the idea of Earth spheres. So this recognizes the atmosphere, the biosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, the land itself, which natural scientists commonly use to understand how the biophysical environment operates. The center of the diagram are the institutions that are important for a food system. These include the regulative system, essentially the role of government, the role of rules and legislations to be able to influence a food system. An example here might be food safety regulations that require that food is clearly labeled and that sell-by dates are available. The normative framework, essentially here are the values, the fact that some people choose to fast at particular times of the year, others may choose not to eat particular foods because it is regarded as being taboo for this in their environments, but the kinds of things that allow us to shape our choices and our decisions that essentially are derived from our culture and from our belief systems. And finally, there are the cognitive systems, the ways in which we think and react to food, the fact that certain things about food we may find pleasurable or we may find disgusting. So these are the things that shape how we as humans interact with our food environment. Critically here is the coordination of these different ways in which the institutions operate and shape our food choices. In the center of the diagram are the activities and the actors. And here critically we see the value chain that links the production component of the food system to the consumption environment. In the middle you have there the food supply, the way in which food is produced and is processed, how we go about sourcing inputs to be able to produce that food, and how that food then is used, sold on the market, and ultimately reaches the consumer. We have the innovation and branding component of the food supply system, how we create new types of food, new ways of storing food, and new ways of selling food. To the right of the diagram then is the food demand component. This is the realm of the consumer, who must source and choose and prepare food, and ultimately who converts that food into nutrients that allows them to live a healthy and long life. Finally, in the middle, we have the food loss and waste, which recognizes that some share of our food is not consumed and is lost. It takes place in the fields or in the factory. Some of that is waste that takes place in the household of the consumer. At the bottom of the diagram, we have our 4 food system outcomes: food and nutrition security and health, the livelihoods of the people involved in the food system, both in urban and in rural areas, the sustainability of the food system in terms of its impact upon the environment, and finally, the balance of the food system in terms of how it benefits people living in different territories or in different places. So each of these 4 is seen as an important outcome of a well-functioning food system. I want to return to what I think is actually quite an important question. Why in FSNet do we talk about an African food system, when it's quite clear that Africa comprises many countries and many cultures and many regions? As is often quipped, Africa is not a country. But I think we've done this quite deliberately to recognize a number of shared features of an African food system. Remember, I talked about concepts and concepts having history. One thing that is common to most parts of Africa is a shared history of colonization and of deliberate underdevelopment that have been experienced. This is something which binds, I think, most African countries, and it's something which allows us to think about what do we mean when we are using concepts or ideas that are being brought from other parts and that were used as part of the colonization process. So firstly, we share a history in Africa, and it's a history which has links to conscious underdevelopment. The second is, despite the end of colonization back in the 1960s, the terms in which African countries have been included into the world system remain, in general, adverse. And there's, as a result, been a shared purpose of decolonization, of recognizing that we need to think differently, we need to invent our own concepts, and we need to think more carefully and more critically about the way in which Africa has been brought into the food system and the global food system, how we benefit and what we lose. Responding to that shared history are the investments, collaborations, and regulations that are being carried out now as part of a Pan-African governance. The African Research Universities Association is a direct example of that kind of collaboration. And the African Research Universities Association is one of the sponsors of the FSNet program, and one of the ways in which we are trying to bring about that shared, the new ways in which we can collaborate. Next is the increasing integration of countries on the African continent, both as trading partners, as investors, where workers are moving between countries, where farmers are learning from one another, and where consumers are also both learning from one another and buying products from other African countries. And finally, there's the shared vision of the challenges and opportunities that face African governments and citizens on the continent, and how we're going to go about addressing these. I will talk a little bit later about Agenda 2063 as one of the ways in which Pan-African governance has been attempted. So again, to remind you, we can also conceptualize Africa itself in different ways. In the framework, I've given you some ideas about the ways in which Africa can be divided into different zones, whether they are agroecological or based on the different languages which are spoken in Africa, or on issues of climate change, or in the center at the bottom right, the way in which the African Union defines Africa into a set of 5 regions. And finally, we can continue to conceptualize Africa in terms of the way in which the continent was divided up after the Berlin Conference of 1884, in which most parts of the continent were awarded to different Western powers. So we can conceptualize Africa itself, and the framework provides you some ways in which we might go about doing that and try and organize our work. Critically, if you think about conceptualizing Africa in terms of food systems, you would note that many of the food systems that might apply would cross over territorial or government boundaries now, and the boundaries of the countries in Africa. So what I think is particularly use to the FSNet program is how we think about research, which is both transdisciplinary, but also which cuts across the boundaries of the countries that are involved. And cross-country research would be a very useful way of supporting our notion of building food systems on the continent. The rest of the world also conceptualizes Africa. And here I've taken the covers of some of the major magazines that are published in the world and shown how at times Africa is seen as something which is rising and improving and is going to be the source of food in the world and the source of economic prosperity in the world. But also within the same year, Africa can be described as the hopeless continent, or the continent that experiences agony, and the depictions are of poverty and of war. I think our task is to learn how to move beyond these ways of conceptualizing Africa and thinking about how we can apply new ways of thinking about the continent and the experiences of people on the continent. So to do that, let's dig back and look at some of the evidence. In fact, despite the depiction of Africa as a place needing support, over the last 2 decades, the countries in Africa have experienced a period of prosperity, Significant economic growth has occurred in most countries of the continent. And as you see on the top right-hand corner, our per capita gross national income, the way in which we measure economic wealth, has steadily grown from 2000 right the way through to 2016. There have been concerns recently that Africa was entering a new recession. And in 2020, even prior to COVID, there were suggestions that Africa was experiencing its first recession in 20 years. You can see this in the bottom right and the bottom left-hand corner of the presentation, where I've shown you the economic growth rate of Nigeria, Africa's largest economy. And you can see the decline that has taken place over this during the period of COVID, as the economy slowly went into recession. But generally what we're seeing both Nigeria and in Africa and other African economies is a steady recovery despite the dislocation and disruption of COVID. Finally, on the bottom right-hand corner are the relative sizes of the largest economies in Africa. In the center are the economies in 2010, outer ring are the economies in 2015. What is important to note here are the size of the South African economy, which was the largest in 2010, and how that now has been overtaken by the economy of Nigeria. So across the board, countries in Africa have experienced economic growth, which has also resulted in a shift in the economic giants of the continent. This has had a direct implication for changes in our food security. This graph uses an indicator developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization, Dietary Energy Supply, and is an index which ranges from 100%, which is where there is sufficient food to feed a population, and rises thereafter. We can see for all of the major economies in Africa, there's been an improvement. Almost all now sit above the 100% mark, where countries are producing sufficient food to feed their populations. Now let's look at some of the drivers of change of the food system. Probably the most critical has been the demographic drivers. So firstly, the population of Africa continues to increase faster than anywhere else in the world. This is despite declining fertility rates, and in fact is not driven only by high levels of fertility, but actually more directly driven by declines in the mortality rate. Our population is healthier and people are living for longer, which means that as new people are born, the population itself is increasing. The graph depicts from 1990 and projects out to 2050 the growth of of the urban areas and of the rural population. At the bottom in the gray are the growth rates of Africa's megacities, cities that have a population of more than 10 million people, such as Kinshasa or Laos. As you can see, that growth is striking, but in fact, bulk of urban population growth is going to take place in smaller cities, including smaller towns in rural areas. So although the rural population will continue to increase, it will decrease as the share of the total population, and more people are going to be living in smaller towns, as well as in Africa's megacities. I've shown you here the largest cities on the continent, with Cairo and Lagos being the two largest, but also other cities such as Kinshasa, Luanda, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa, all of which are growing rapidly. These bring challenges for a food system. As an example, in Kinshasa, 81% of the urban population lack access to improved drinking water, absolutely critical component of a food system, while 90% of the natural springs in the city are thought to be contaminated. So while urbanization brings potential opportunities for greater economic prosperity, they also bring challenges in terms of providing adequate services and being able to meet the logistic requirements of feeding large populations. Moving on to another important socioeconomic driver. I've already commented on how African countries have experienced sustained economic growth, and this in turn has brought prosperity for the population of the countries. The African Development Bank estimates that an increasing number of Africa's population can be described as middle class. It's a modest definition of middle class. meaning earning more than $2 per day. But nonetheless, it does mean that there are significant changes taking place to the kinds of consumption of people living on the continent. For example, that report observed already in 2015, there were 125 million smartphones in Africa. That number has more or less doubled since then. That there's been an increase in the ownership of motor vehicles, an increase in the availability of financial services, with more African countries now having finance markets established, as well as changes in consumption patterns, as well as increasing education. It comes at a cost. It's noteworthy that 7 out of 10 of the world's most unequal countries are in Africa, as economic growth benefits a smaller group, and while many are not enjoying the benefits of that economic growth. As an example of some of the changes that this produces are the links between urban and rural areas and the congestion of the urban areas. This is a photograph taken in Kampala some years ago, which shows the taxi ranks that I suspect that many of you are familiar with. Next, turning to political and governance drivers. Probably the most key thing to be aware of is the Agenda 2063 and the aspirations of the African continent. They are provided in your framework document in some detail, and they will give you some sense of the goals that African countries have set themselves. Many of these do relate to the food system and how the food systems can be improved. One of the most important is moving towards greater integration of trading systems in Africa. And part of that is a return to the initiative that was started some 40 years ago to try and link Africa through its trans-African highways, which includes also transportation by rail. Again, while political integration has benefits, it also may present challenges. One part of that is the supermarket, what's being referred to as the supermarketization of the food system, in which increasingly across the continent, more people are purchasing a greater share of their food from supermarkets. While there is a good considerable convenience to this, and sometimes the supermarkets may offer healthy food at a low cost, there is a concern that many supermarkets also promote foods which are unhealthy and which have a high fat, salt, or sugar content. Also of concern is the economic power of those supermarkets. And thus, for example, back in 2015, Shoprite Holdings, South Africa's largest food chain, already had more than 1,000 supermarkets, of which nearly 200 were located in countries other than Africa. The same applies to a range of other international supermarket chains, which are increasingly supplying the urban population of the continent. I've mentioned how supermarkets might promote the consumption of foods that are unhealthy. And indeed, one of the key concerns facing the many countries in Africa has been the rise of the population who are overweight and obese. In the case of South Africa, for example, 60% of adult women are categorized as being either overweight or obese, a trend which is taking place in other African countries, including Ghana, a country such as Egypt being one of the fastest growing areas in terms of poor eating habits. The implications are quite serious. In particular, prevalence of overweight and obesity has also led to an increase in the prevalence of diet-related non-communicable disease. The example which we talk about in the framework is that of diabetes, where across the board in Africa, countries are experiencing an increase in the prevalence of diabetes. A concern because this is an illness which is expensive to manage and has a strong impact upon people's lifestyle. Another aspect of the changing food environments is the rise of imported staple foods. In particular, here I've shown you the increase of imports of wheat and of rice, which increased by 62% between 2007 and 2011, and which continue to increase. Both items have been identified as priorities by many African countries to try and encourage local farmers to begin production. So a range of African countries now, for example, are focusing on encouraging the cultivation of rice and the development of rice which is suitable to grow in the African environment. Now, having taken you through the different drivers of a food system change, having talked about the components and the different outcomes of the food system, I'd like to return to our conceptual framework, the FSNet framework for food systems in Africa. And to try and illustrate what I've been talking about by pointing out ways in which the food system may be failing, to identify the challenges of the food system. I'm using South Africa because it's the country I'm most familiar with, and I'm going to describe some of the challenges that we have identified as we start to prepare for the UN Food Summit that will take place in New York in September. At the top of the diagram under drivers, you will see the green arrow. Here, the concern is the South African food system is very vulnerable to shocks, in particular drought, rising temperatures, and most recently the COVID pandemic. These shocks to our food system result in either reduced consumption, changes in behavior, and in the case of COVID, meant that for nearly 2 months, informal sector food traders weren't able to carry out their business. Even currently, many aspects of the food system remain severely disrupted by the restrictions on movement and on consumption patterns. Again, another important component of food system challenges in South Africa relate to access to the different capitals. Because of its history, South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world, and that inequality extends to the access of smallholder farmers to land, to water, to finance markets, as well as to knowledge and as well as to networks. So we've identified that as a particularly important challenge to the South African food system. Next in the middle, in the purple, and probably in common with many African countries, food systems are extremely difficult to govern, and in particular, to be able to coordinate different regulations between different departments of government, between the private, public, and civil society components of a country, as well as at the different levels of government, whether national, provincial, or state, or local. How to bring together the different actors involved in governing the food system, in managing the regulatory components of the food system, remains a particularly difficult problem of coordination, particularly when different aspects, different actors in the food system may have contrasting or even conflicting views about what needs to change. Another challenge that we've identified in the context of South Africa is that the food system is highly concentrated, with a small number of producers, a smaller number of food processors, and a very small number of major food chains. So it is a highly concentrated sector that also, as a result, can be very vulnerable to shocks. Over here, we are concerned about the existence of unsustainable practices in the production of food. Excessively intensive cultivation of land leading to land degradation is one example. Excessive use of non-organic pesticides, chemicals to grow food are also another aspect that we are concerned about. Next, on the yellow, is the concern about a double burden that we have in South Africa, a double burden of over and undernutrition, where we simultaneously have stunted under 5 children, as well as overweight and obese mothers. I've put this up as a way of showing you how our conceptualization of a food system can be used to identify challenges and how we can use those then to design our research projects, something which I think you will be doing very shortly as part of your FSNet training. To show you how to apply this framework, I've chosen again a topic which I'm very interested in, and this is the double burden of under and overnutrition in South Africa. In trying to map out my own research, I've broken down that double burden into a set of sub-challenges. At the top, hidden hunger, referring to micronutrient deficiency amongst women and children. Next, under 5 stunting. In South Africa, we've had under 5 stunting, 25% of children for almost 2 decades. Next, the sub-challenge of child and adult overweight and obesity. As I've already mentioned, we have a very high level of overweight and obesity among adults, and now we're starting to see the emergence of overweight and obesity among children and among adolescents. Then to each of these, I've tried to think, what might be the cause? What are the causes of, for example, hidden hunger? Their cause that we have, the research has identified, is that of inadequate dietary diversity, where women and children are not getting a sufficiently wide range of food types to eat. Under 5 stunting, we know in South Africa we have that children under 5 have inadequate diets, and this includes very low prevalences of exclusive breastfeeding for infants. Another cause that we have identified is enteric infections, diarrheas, that have affected under 5 children. Next, as a research project, I need to push beyond what the cause is and to try and think, what is the cause of that cause? Let's go back to the top then. Inadequate dietary diversity. One of the reasons why women and children are not getting the diverse diets that they require is the very high cost of healthy foods in South Africa, particularly fruit and vegetables. Also, we know that what's available in low-income areas often do not provide the healthy foods and tend to be focused on food that is shelf stable and snack foods. Moving down to my next cause, enteric infections. There we know that the cause of that are the poor water and sanitary and hygiene conditions and practices of many poor people are experiencing. I won't take you through all of the components of this diagram, but I think if you look at it carefully, you should be able to see how we can move then from a research challenge, in my case, the double burden, breaking down that challenge into its components, identifying the causes of those components, and then pushing further to think about the cause of the cause. The last row then are what then would be the driver of those different issues. And in each case, let me take you back to the top. The fact the high cost of fruit and veg is driven by the income poverty that makes these unaffordable for large numbers of poor people. What's on the shelf of low-income areas speaks to the inequality that we face in South Africa, where different products are available in low and high income neighborhoods. So here's something you could think about as an exercise. I've taken another challenge, in this instance, unsustainable practices of producing food. In thinking through what I might consider to be sub-challenges, one would be the link between water and energy and the availability of water and energy. Another might be the differences between different areas of a country, the territorial imbalances. Another challenge would be the loss of biodiversity. Another, the loss of livelihoods, and another, the loss of soil health. So my question to you then would be, what might be the causes that you could identify that are relevant to the area in which you're thinking about doing your research? And what would be the causes of those? So what are the causes of the causes that you identify of challenges for the water-energy nexus, or the loss of biodiversity, or the loss of livelihoods? As we move towards the conclusion of the framework, our purpose has been to try and firstly give you some sense of how to conceptualize an African food system. Second, how you might use that conceptualization of an African food system to identify research problems that you want to investigate. And then finally, the review also tried to identify the knowledge gaps that would be important. Yeah, the list that we provided here, firstly, how do we go about mapping different food systems and mapping the policy landscape? So in the specific context of the country in which you might be working, or the region which you might be working, what would a food system map look like? Who are the providers? Who are the actors? What are the activities? What is the policy landscape? What are the different types of legislations that operate on the food system? Next, how do the different systems interact? And in particular, a recent literature on using a nexus approach to understanding the interactions of different systems. Again, there's a literature there which you can consult and allows you to understand how things such as a water-energy nexus operate on the food system. As we see changes, it will be important to research both the legal issues that inform the food system and how rights-based approaches could also allow us to understand better how the operation of a food system. The literature shows us that the indicators that are used to measure food system performance require further refinement. Many indicators often suggest contradictory results, where we see people's perception of food insecurity declining at the same time as that they're experiencing direct consequences of inadequate food and nutrition. We've yet to demonstrate adequately what are the costs of negative food system outcomes. What is the impact, for example, of South Africa's double burden of malnutrition? What is the result of a sustained trend of stunting among our under 5 children? Then, with the pace of urbanization that I've discussed, how do we ensure food safety? Thus, as an example, in South Africa in 2018, we faced an outbreak of listeriosis, much to do with how the food system was operating, and ultimately which resulted in death as well as considerable disruption to the food system. I've mentioned several times the idea of trying to think about how food is produced and consumed in a particular location, and how do we think about using a territorial approach to understanding better the rural-urban interface between towns and the rural areas that surround them. What are the flows of goods from urban areas to rural areas, and how does food go from rural to urban? What are the roles of different kinds of traders in that process? All of those are research questions that allow us to think about a territorial approach. Next, what are the opportunities to foster better transitions to agroecology without sacrificing output or competitiveness? In other words, how do we go about building food systems in Africa that do not go down the pathways of other countries where the adoption of technologies have resulted in further degradation of landscapes and environments? How do we bring about working with nature, using our science to work with nature, and at the same time achieve outputs and be competitive in the global market? Next, Africa has been characterized by a number of underutilized crops which have been displaced by new products. An example here are the grains that we consume, the sorghums and the millets, which are being displaced by maize. What role is there for indigenous crops, indigenous livestock, and indigenous ways of managing the environment? How do we ensure that these are not lost and that these contribute towards building our food system? And then lastly, as Africa moves into a fourth industrial revolution, how do we start thinking about using data science to fill knowledge gaps and predict futures, to work with large data sets to be able to better understand how things are changing? So to conclude, the framework document sets out a way of thinking, and it is hopefully will be a learning tool for you to be able to use in designing your own research problems. It outlines a number of critical trends, the ones which I want to focus on here: the rapid urbanization of the continent, the rising incomes, and the growing middle class. It focuses on the effects of these trends, the changing lifestyles, preferences, and consumer choice behaviors, the fact that there's a declining per capita consumption of local staples and a rising consumption of processed foods and imported staples, the increasing use of technology in the food supply systems, whether it's digital technologies and the use of mobile phones, or the use of precision agriculture to be able to better farm, the ways in which the labor markets are changing, and the likelihood of greater non-farm employment in rural areas, where people who no longer are farming are now need to find and build livelihoods. Finally, a set of challenges: how to build resilient food systems in the face of a changing climate, how to protect the livelihoods of poor and marginal food stakeholders, how to supply urban communities with adequate and safe and nourishing food, issues of how to address land tenure security as we move towards changing environments in rural areas, the non-farm opportunities in the food economy, how to both increase the pace of innovation and to have improved production technologies at the same time as thinking how to indigenize these and adapt them for use in the African food systems. Throughout, how to think about improving food governance, and finally, how to integrate African food systems in a way that recognizes the importance of a territorial imbalance. I hope that the framework will be of use to you, and that this webinar will be able to assist you in how to read the framework and how to apply it to your work.